She boarded a commercial flight and blended in, just another passenger in 12F, until those few characters in her call sign on the manifest triggered a very elite reaction from an F-22 squadron commander at the stop. The airport was alive with its usual chaos. Screens flickered with departure times, luggage wheels rattled across polished floors, and voices overlapped in a dozen languages. Travelers hurried to gates with coffee in hand, children clutched stuffed animals, and the PA system chimed with yet another boarding call. Amid the crowd, she moved quietly, blending into the sea of passengers. Dressed simply in jeans and a lightweight jacket, she didn't look like someone who could command attention. She held her boarding pass in one hand, carry-on in the other, and slipped past the clusters of travelers toward her gate. The number printed at the top of her ticket, Seat 12F, meant little to anyone else, but to her, it was just a window seat, a small comfort for the long flight ahead. When boarding began, she didn't rush. She wasn't the type to jostle for position in line. Instead, she waited until most of the eager passengers had already filed down the jet bridge. By the time she entered the aircraft, the cabin was already filled with the rustle of people settling in. Overhead bins slammed shut, seatbelts clicked, and conversations rose and fell in uneven rhythms. She made her way down the narrow aisle, brushing past shoulders and elbows until she reached her row. A middle-aged man sat in the aisle seat, already absorbed in his phone. The middle seat, mercifully, was empty. She smiled faintly, an unexpected stroke of luck. Sliding into 12F, she placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her and leaned back, gazing out at the tarmac. The sight was familiar but never lost its sense of quiet wonder, massive jets taxiing like obedient giants, ground crews weaving in T-vests, and the sun gleaming off steel wings. For her, the window was always the best seat in the house. A chance to detach from the noise, to watch the earth shrink away and the sky open wide. The flight attendants moved briskly through the cabin, offering polite smiles, checking overhead bins, and reciting the well-worn phrases of safety instructions. She listened absently, her mind wandering. To any casual observer, she was just another traveler, another face in a crowd of hundreds who would pass through the airport that day. Nothing about her suggested importance. Nothing about her hinted at the truth. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its slow taxi to the runway, she folded her arms and closed her eyes for a moment. Around her, the cabin filled with the familiar sounds, seatbelts snapping, babies fussing, nervous laughter from first-time flyers. It was ordinary. Comfortably ordinary, but hundreds of miles away, in a briefing room lit with sterile fluorescent light, someone's eyes landed on a manifest. Among the routine paperwork, a list of passengers, seating assignments, call signs attached for security. One set of characters stood out. A call sign that carried weight. History. Reputation. The officer reading the list frowned, then read it again, his pulse quickening. He knew the name. More than that, he knew the story behind it. And if the manifest was correct, that very call sign was assigned to the passenger sitting in seat 12F on a commercial flight cruising toward their airspace. The officer didn't hesitate. He rose from his chair, papers still in hand, and strode into the adjoining room. There, the squadron commander sat surrounded by his pilots, their conversation buzzing with the kind of casual energy that filled a room before a mission. He barely looked up when the officer entered, until the manifest was placed in front of him. His ES scanned the lines. Then they stopped. The room went quiet as his expression shifted. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by something else, respect, sharpened into focus. That he looked up slowly, his gaze cutting through the air like steel. "She's here?" he asked, his voice low but certain. "Yes, sir," the officer confirmed. Seat 12F. The commander leaned back in his chair, the weight of the realization settling over him. The chatter in the room had faded into silence. Every pilot's attention was fixed on him now, waiting for his reaction, and when it came, it wasn't casual curiosity. It was the stillness of a man who understood exactly who he was dealing with. A passenger in seat 12F. But no ordinary passenger. The plane climbed steadily into the sky, engines humming like a steady heartbeat. Passengers settled into the lull of the flight, overhead fans clicked on, seatbelt signs dinged off, and the smell of reheated meals drifted faintly from the galley.in seat 12F. She leaned her head against the window, watching as the world below shrank into a patchwork of fields and rivers. She traced the clouds with her eyes, allowing the quiet monotony of the flight to wash over her. It was supposed to be routine, uneventful, an escape into anonymity. Around her, life unfolded as usual. A toddler behind her kicked the seat rhythmically until his mother gently scolded him. Across the aisle, a teenager chewed gum noisily while flipping through his phone. The man in 12D still hadn't looked up from his screen, absorbed in whatever business emails or games kept his attention. She let out a soft sigh. For her, the boredom was comforting. No drills, no missions, no eyes watching her every move. Just clouds, coffee, and the quiet rhythm of travel, but far away, boredom had given way to shock.at the base. In the squadron's ready room, the manifest still lay on the table. The call sign circled in red ink, L. Icon alarm bell no one could ignore. The commander's hand hovered over the page, his finger tapping once against the characters. He didn't need to read it a second time, he knew exactly what it meant. The call sign wasn't just letters and numbers, it was a story, a legacy, a reminder of battles fought and victories carved out of impossible odds. Are you certain? He asked again, though his tone suggested he already believed it. Yes, sir, the officer replied, his voice clipped. Cross-checked twice. She's on that flight. Seat 12F. The pilots around the table exchanged uncertain glances. Most of them were younger, trained on stories that sounded like myths, names that were whispered with reverence during their early days in the academy. To them, this call sign was legendary, like reading the name of a ghost who had once flown among the best. The commander's jaw tightened. He remembered. He had flown long enough to know the truth behind the stories, to have witnessed some of it himself. The memory wasn't just ink on a page. It was real, and now, the woman who carried that call sign wasn't in a cockpit. She wasn't leading a squadron. She wasn't commanding from a base, she was sitting quietly in seat 12F on a civilian flight, as if she were just another passenger. The absurdity of it struck him. For a moment, he almost allowed himself a smile. Almost. Why would she be on a commercial plane? One of the younger pilots asked, his voice hesitant. Someone like her. The commander didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the manifest again, as though the paper itself might give him clarity. But the answer wasn't there. Whatever reason she had, it was hers alone. What mattered was simple: she was here, in their airspace, on their radar. And whether she intended it or not, her presence would ripple through them all. Back on the plane, she shifted in her seat, unaware of the commotion her name had caused. The flight attendant rolled a cart down the aisle, asking softly, "Coffee or tea?" She smiled politely, choosing coffee, then cradled the warm cup between her hands. Ordinary. Quiet. Uneventful, but above the clouds, fighter jets prowled their sectors, and in the commander's office, an unspoken decision was taking shape. The briefing room had fallen into an unnatural silence. The chatter of pilots trading jokes, the scratching of pens on flight logs, all of it had evaporated the moment the commander's finger landed on that call sign. That he sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on the page, though his mind was already 1,000 miles away. Memories flickered behind his sharp gaze, distant missions, crackling radios, and the voice that had once carried that call sign across secure channels. It wasn't just a name, it was a presence, one that had shaped entire sorties, one that had saved lives. That he leaned back in his chair slowly, the leather creaking under his weight. His jaw worked, but no words came yet. Around him, his pilots shifted uneasily, glancing at each other but daring not to speak. They had seen their commander serious before, but not like this. Finally, he exhaled, a sound that seemed to release the tension in the room, though it didn't ease it. "You're telling me," he said at last, his voice low, deliberate, "that she's sitting on a civilian flight?" Seat 12F. "Yes, sir," the officer confirmed, though his tone was laced with the same disbelief. The commander's eyes narrowed. After everything, after all she's done, she's a passenger. No one dared answer that. He closed the manifest folder with a sharp snap and stood, his tall frame dominating the room. He paced once, twice, the sound of his boots echoing off the walls. Each step seemed to grow heavier with the weight of realization. She doesn't belong on a flight like that, he muttered, almost to himself. She belongs up here. He gestured toward the ceiling, toward the endless sky beyond the roof, where the squadron's jets cut their arcs through the clouds. One of the younger pilots, braver, or perhaps more naive than the rest, spoke up. Sir, with respect, is it really her? Could it be a mistake? The commander stopped mid-step and turned, his gaze pinning the young man where he sat. The intensity in his eyes was enough to silence the room all over again. There is no mistake, he said firmly. That call sign is hers. And when you've heard it once, you don't forget it. The young pilot's face paled, and he looked down at the table. The commander resumed pacing, but this time his steps were slower, more deliberate. His thoughts were racing. What did it mean that she was here, quietly tucked into seat 12F? Why now? Why like this? He remembered the last time he had flown with her. A mission that had seemed impossible, odds stacked so high against them that even seasoned veterans had doubted they'd make it back. But she hadn't wavered. Her calm voice had cut through the radio static, steady and unwavering, guiding them through the chaos with precision. They hadn't just survived, they had triumphed, and now that same presence was reduced, in the eyes of strangers, to just another traveler clutching a boarding pass. The thought stirred something deep inside him, frustration, perhaps, but also a profound respect. She doesn't need a uniform to command respect, he said finally, almost as if answering his own unspoken question. She carries it with her, wherever she goes. The room stayed quiet, every pilot hanging on his words that if the call sign on the manifest was real, and he had no doubt that it was, then this flight was no longer just another blip on the radar. That it had become something far more significant. The commander's decision was already forming. He couldn't ignore her presence, not when it had shaken him to his core. Whether she wanted it or not, she would not remain invisible. Not to him. Not to the men and women who had been shaped by her legacy. That he straightened his shoulders and looked at the officer. I want her flagged. If she lands within our range, I'll be there. Understood? Yes, sir, the officer replied immediately, scribbling notes with hurried strokes. The commander's gaze lingered on the manifest one last time. The weight of those few letters, that simple call sign, had shifted everything. Seat 12F.to the world, she was nobody. To him, and to the sky, she was unforgettable. On the plane, she looked no different than anyone else. The hum of the engines created a lull that pushed most passengers into sleep or distraction. A few tapped at their laptops, others adjusted neck pillows, while the flight attendants wheeled carts down the aisles with practiced efficiency. From her seat in 12F, she gazed through the window at the endless blue horizon. Her reflection in the glass showed a calm young woman, ordinary, unremarkable, and unnoticed by those around her. She preferred it that way. The man in 12D still hadn't spoken a word, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone. A couple across the aisle shared whispered jokes, their laughter drowned out by the steady roar of the engines. To everyone in the cabin, she was simply another passenger, but appearances had a way of deceiving. She closed her eyes briefly, memories brushing the edges of her thoughts like the wind against a canopy. The sharp tang of jet fuel, the tremor of turbulence in her bones, the rhythm of radio chatter, it all seemed so distant now. But the call sign she carried had once been her heartbeat. It wasn't just letters stitched onto a patch. It was her story, forged through fire, through choices that had cost her dearly. She had never been one for glory. She didn't chase recognition. She had flown because she believed in the mission, in the people at her side, and in something greater than herself. And though she had left that world behind, or tried to, it seemed her past hadn't quite let her go. Miles away, in the commander's office, her call sign had already rippled through the squadron. To them, she wasn't anonymous. She was legend, the younger pilots whispered among themselves after the commander's revelation. Some were skeptical, others awestruck. Do you really think it's her? One asked, his voice low but tinged with excitement. It has to be, another replied. Nobody else carries that call sign. Nobody. They fell silent when the commander entered, his presence heavy with unspoken thoughts. He knew better than to indulge their speculation. But he also knew what her name meant, and why it demanded silence, not chatter. He remembered missions where she had flown into storms others wouldn't dare. He remembered the precision of her maneuvers, the way her calm voice had steadied the entire squadron in the worst of moments. She hadn't been loud or boastful. She hadn't needed to be. She let her actions speak, and in doing so, she had etched her place into the annals of memory, and now she was here, sitting quietly in seat 12F, sipping coffee like an ordinary traveler. The commander couldn't shake the image. To the strangers beside her, she was invisible. But to him, she was impossible to ignore. Back on the plane, she opened her eyes again, her gaze settling once more on the clouds. A faint smile touched her lips, not out of joy, but from the strange comfort of being unseen. She had carried the weight of her identity long enough. Here, no one asked questions. No one looked at her differently. She was free, if only for a few hours, to be just another passenger. But freedom was fragile. As the plane continued its course, she had no idea that her presence had already stirred something far greater on the ground. The commander's respect, the squadron's whispers, the weight of her legacy, they were all converging toward her. Even as she sat in silence, she was unseen to those around her. But her identity was alive in the hearts of those who knew what that call sign meant, and soon, that truth would no longer stay hidden. The plane was halfway through its flight when the air shifted, not physically, but in the unseen undercurrent that travels with rumor and recognition. She didn't notice it at first. To her, the flight remained ordinary. She sipped her coffee, glanced at the clouds, and allowed herself the luxury of anonymity, but not everyone remained oblivious. Somewhere between her boarding pass and the manifest, her name, her call sign, had been flagged. Information moved quietly, passed hand to hand, whispered across radios, and filtered through secure networks. By the time the flight had reached cruising altitude, her identity had already reached ears she hadn't expected. At the air base, the squadron commander had made his position clear. This wasn't something to be taken lightly. She wasn't just anyone. She was someone whose history carried weight, whose presence demanded respect, and that respect began to ripple outward. Inside the commercial cabin, it started subtly. A flight attendant, who had been going through the motions of pouring drinks and distributing snacks, paused when she glanced at the passenger list again. Her eyes flicked toward 12F, lingering just a second too long. Her expression changed, not dramatically, but with a flicker of recognition, like someone seeing a familiar figure in an unexpected place. The woman in 12F didn't notice. She was tracing the arc of the horizon with her eyes, lost in her owl. End thoughts. Later, when the same flight attendant returned, her tone carried an unfamiliar softness. Another coffee, miss? She asked, almost deferentially. She blinked in surprise, then nodded. Thank you. The man in 12D finally looked up from his phone, frowning at the sudden shift in tone. He glanced at her, then at the attendant, then back again. Something unspoken passed between them, something he didn't quite understand. It wasn't just inside the plane. At the base, younger pilots who had grown up with her name in their textbooks whispered among themselves, struggling to reconcile the image of her call sign with the thought of her sitting in coach on a civilian jet. She's a legend, one of them muttered, awe in his voice. And she's just out there with everyone else. The commander overheard but didn't correct them. He simply gave a tight nod, his expression unreadable. Back in seat 12F, she began to sense the change. The glances. The subtle hush in tone when people addressed her. She wasn't naive. She knew that once her name was spoken aloud, it couldn't be unsaid. The world had a way of remembering, even when she wanted to forget. A part of her longed for invisibility, for the peace of being no one of consequence. But another part, the part forged in missions, in choices that had saved lives, understood. Respect was not something she could hide from forever. Still, the attention was awkward. The man beside her shifted uneasily, his curiosity now replacing indifference. Across the aisle, the couple who had ignored her earlier whispered to each other, occasionally stealing glances. She could feel the weight of their questions pressing against her, though none dared ask aloud. Her jaw tightened. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't boarded the plane seeking recognition. She had only wanted a flight like any other. But the truth had a way of catching you. No matter how high or far she flew. As the engines droned and the cabin lights dimmed, she leaned her head against the window again. The sky stretched endlessly beyond the glass, vast and indifferent to the chatter of human recognition in that endless blue. She found her calm. The respect of others might be awkward, unexpected, even uncomfortable, but it was also real. And deep down, she knew it wasn't about glory. It wasn't about being treated differently. It was about acknowledgement. A quiet reminder that what she had done, who she had been, mattered. The cabin had settled into its mid-flight rhythm. Overhead lights dimmed, window shades half drawn, and the steady hum of engines filled the air like a lullaby. Most passengers had drifted into sleep, headphones on or books resting open in their laps, but seat 12F remained awake. She gazed out the window at the endless sea of clouds below, silvered by the fading sun. The world looked quiet from this height, detached from the noise of human voices. And yet, in that silence, she knew 1,000 unspoken things were moving beneath the surface. The awkward glances had faded into a kind of hushed reverence. The man in 12D no longer ignored her, though he avoided staring. His posture had changed, less dismissive, more careful. The flight attendants, too, carried a quiet awareness, offering her small courtesies without fanfare. It wasn't obvious to most, but she could feel it in the air, a recognition, like ripples in still water. She didn't ask for it. She hadn't wanted it. And yet, here it was, far below, at the air base. The squadron remained alert. The commander hadn't said much after issuing his order, but his presence had spoken volumes. The younger pilots sensed the gravity in his silence. They whispered to each other when he wasn't listening, trading stories they had heard about her, missions legendary, maneuvers impossible, victories that sounded like fiction, but the commander knew better. They weren't stories. They were truths. He had seen them. He had heard her voice cutting through static, calm even when the skies roared with chaos. And now, she was flying over his airspace not as a commander, not as a pilot, but as a passenger in 12F. It was humbling. Back on the plane, she pressed her forehead lightly against the window. Her reflection looked back at her, tired eyes, calm features, nothing extraordinary to anyone else. But behind those eyes lived the weight of every decision she had made, every mission she had flown, every loss she had carried, and now, all of it was reduced to silence. She thought of the commander without knowing it, how he might react if he saw her now, anonymous among strangers. Would he laugh at the irony? Would he salute, as he once had in the heat of battle? Or would he simply nod, a gesture between two people who understood the sky in ways others never could? The plane began its gentle descent. Seatbelts clicked, trays snapped upright, and passengers stirred from restless naps. The city lights shimmered below, golden veins threading through the dark earth. When the wheels touched down, applause rippled through the cabin, a habit some passengers clung to, a small celebration of arrival. She didn't clap. She sat quietly, letting the moment pass. Disembarking was the same blur it always was, bags pulled from bins, elbows brushed in the aisle, polite thank yous to the crew. She moved with the tide, her carry-on in hand, her head slightly bowed. To most, she was invisible again. Just another traveler lost in the crowd, but invisibility was never absolute. At the gate, as passengers spilled into the terminal, she noticed a man in uniform standing near the edge of the crowd. His posture was unmistakable, rigid, precise, carrying the weight of authority. His eyes found hers instantal. For a moment, neither moved, and whether she wanted it or not, the world, at least this small piece of it, had remembered. Then, in the middle of the bustling airport, the commander straightened. His hand rose in a crisp salute, the noise of the terminal seemed to fade. People walked by, oblivious, but she felt the weight of the gesture all the same. It wasn't about show. It wasn't about glory. It was about acknowledgement. She didn't return the salute, at least not formally. Instead, she gave the smallest nod, a quiet acceptance of what the moment meant. Then she turned, blending back into the flow of passengers, swallowed once more by the ordinary. The story wasn't told in applause or speeches. It wasn't broadcast in headlines. It was written in silence. In a call sign whispered. In a salute shared between those who remembered. Seat 12F was just another number to most. But to those who knew, it would always mean something more.